Good afternoon and welcome to SportWorks Talks. My name is Christian Page and welcome to our tech series. With me today, my good friend and colleague, Adrian Corcoran. How are you, Adrian?
I'm excellent, Christian. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today.
Oh, it's great to have you on the program and really looking forward to your presentation today. I'd also like to say hi to everybody online who's joining from around the world. Great to see you with us and great that you could join us this afternoon. As always, if you could pop where you're from and say hello in the chat, we'd like to, it gives us a sense of where you are in the world. So we also have to say good evening and good morning because we know that we reach out in different parts of the planet. Nice to see some familiar faces already popping in there. Good to see you there, Stu. You jumped in the front row. Great to see you with us this afternoon. The basic plan today is we will have a 20-minute or so presentation from Adrian talking about the CGFP and platform for the future of technology and as it goes forward. And then we'll do a 20-minute Q&A at the end. So any questions that you have, please pop them in the chat and then we'll do our best to answer them at the very end of the presentation. So I'm going to say thanks for joining us, everyone, and I'm going to hand over to Adrian.
Thank you very much, Christian. Well, you've heard I'm Adrian Corcoran, and for today's purposes, I'm wearing two hats. So I'm the CIO for something called Commonwealth Games Federation Partnerships, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. And I'm also the CIO for the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games, essentially seconded to the organising committee by CGFP. And I'm expecting Christian to see some slides. There we go. And I think Christian's just going to skip back through to the beginning. We just ran through rehearsal. Obviously, we didn't reset from the top again. Anyway, while we're waiting for that to happen, today I'm going to talk about the affordability challenge faced by mega events and how the Commonwealth Games, and in particular the technology division, is responding to that and is implementing a new template for future games. Now, we'll see the slides in just a second, I hope. So the first slide basically is just going to look at a bit more about what a rollercoaster year 2020 has been to date. It's unbelievable in terms of the amount of crises that have happened since January. And each new crisis essentially has dominated the news agenda for a period of time. And as in any other year, any one of those stories could potentially be the thing that defines the entire year. However, I guess the big one we're all dealing with at the moment is the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has certainly been the biggest driver of social change in a generation, in both how we live and how we work, and in our appreciation of all of those essential frontline workers who keep us all safe and who keep the wheels turning. And clearly this is very much a live issue for our industry right now, and we don't really know what the long-term social and economic impacts will be. But in terms of impact to our industry, we do know that we've seen events cancelled and postponed. We've got empty stadia. We've got athletes who spent years preparing and training, but who can't compete. And I think the pandemic has showed us what a world without sport looks like. And I think it's definitely a lesser place. So I, welcome the careful restart of the sports industry. So there's no doubt that COVID-19 is the newest and biggest challenge that the sports event industry has to deal with. But there are other underlying issues that we also need to tackle, and one of those is the affordability of major events. So this particular slide, I've chosen to use the example of the Summer Olympic Games, simply because it's the most high profile and the one that most people are probably familiar with. But it's worth saying that the issues faced here are also very similar to those faced by the Pan American Games, by the European Games, and many other mega events, including the Commonwealth Games. So this particular table looks at the candidates for the last handful of Summer Olympics, and there are some interesting trends here that you may be aware of. It's worth noting, I think, first of all, that the absolute number of cities that have expressed an interest in hosting the Games has actually declined year on year from 2012. There were 9 cities there, only 7 in 2016, 6 in 2020, and 5 in 2024. And the actual number of candidate cities shortlisted is also following a bit of a countdown trend. So 5 in 2012, then 4, then 3, then 2 for 2024, and I suppose probably 1 with Los Angeles in 2028. Now, much of that reduction in candidate cities has been driven by cities actually withdrawing from the process. So, for example, in 2024, there were 5 candidate cities. However, Hamburg, Budapest, and Rome all withdrew because of declining public support in those cities, often rooted in concern about the costs of staging a mega event. Now, it's also worth remembering that Los Angeles, who obviously along with Paris were down to the final 2, was in itself a last-minute stand-in for Boston, who initially beat Los Angeles and San Francisco, Washington, D.C. as the official US bid. But Boston withdrew based on public polls conducted in early 2015 when there was declining support for the Olympics, and they withdrew from the race, and Los Angeles stepped into that gap. So clearly this is not new news to the industry, it's not new news to the IOC. And in part, I think the response of the IOC has been the Agenda 2020 strategy, which seeks to redefine the whole bidding process. And I was very interested to hear recently my good friend John Giancarlo at the IOC talk about how the IOC technology team are contributing to this on one of the recent SportWorks webinars. And that is well worth watching if you didn't catch it first time. Now, for other smaller multi-sport events, the challenge of finding a pipeline of willing host cities is no less a challenge. And the CGF recognised this particularly when the 2022 Commonwealth Games were awarded in 2015 to Durban in South Africa. But due to financial constraints, the CGF had to rescind that decision 2 years later and restart the search for a host city. And that resulted in Birmingham being awarded the Games in December 2017. I'm aware that not everyone on the call may necessarily know that much about the Commonwealth Games, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes introducing you to Commonwealth Sport. Now, the first Commonwealth Games was actually held in 1930 in Hamilton, Canada, and that featured just 400 athletes from 11 nations competing in 59 events in 6 sports. By 2018 in Gold Coast, Australia, Commonwealth Sport had grown to a voluntary association of 71 nations and territories, with 4,400 athletes competing in 275 events in 18 sports. And Commonwealth Sport nations and territories span the globe and account for 2.4 billion people, or approximately about a third of the world's population. Now, the CGF are the governing body of Commonwealth Sports, and they've set out a clear vision and a strong set of values that appeal to me personally, and at the heart of which are the athletes and the sport, and creating a sport movement that is a catalyst for promoting humanity, equality, and destiny, and generally being a force for good in the world. Now, what I particularly like about this is that there is actual evidence that the Commonwealth Sport is delivering on some of these promises. So the Commonwealth Games were the first games to integrate and generate funds for a goodwill charity partner, and that was Glasgow in 2014. And that's an initiative that now other mega events are beginning to follow as well. The Commonwealth Games is the first and indeed still the only multi-sport event to feature an integrated parasport program for elite athletes. And it's also the first Games to have an equal number of medal events for men and women. That was Gold Coast in 2018. And Birmingham will go one step further by being the first mega event to actually offer more medals for women than for men. It's also the first event to hold a dedicated multi-sport youth games. That was Edinburgh in 2000, and that was 9 years before the equivalent Asian Youth Games, and 10 years before the first Youth Olympic Games, and 21 years before the Junior Pan American Games, which will take place next year. So, like the IOC, the CGF has been very aware of that mega event affordability challenge, and its response to this and to other challenges of staying relevant in a rapidly changing world is set out in something called the Transformation 2022 strategy, and you can find that on the CGF website, which is on the slide. So moving on, as well as thinking about affordability, the Transformation 2022 strategy also considers about how to help future candidate cities better understand the tangible benefits of hosting a mega event, and how this can help to build a strong business case to support the event. So the Commonwealth Games Value Framework is a piece of work carried out by PwC and was published earlier this year, and it looks at the benefits of staging the Commonwealth Games all the way from the most recent one in Gold Coast all the way back to Manchester in 2002. And the value framework itself measures the benefits pre, post, and during the Games. And the benefits are considered across a number of categories, which you can see on the slide there, including local employment and GDP. Now, across all of that range of games, the value framework has identified that the economic boost of hosting the Commonwealth Games is around £1 billion, and that in terms of a return on investment for every £1 of public money invested, there's an economic return of £3.20. So that's a really important part of the story to help candidate cities understand and to build much stronger business cases so they can portray it in that sort of light. There are 6 stages to the Commonwealth Games life cycle, from the initial dialogue stage to the post-games evaluation. Now, the first 3 stages are focused on how to better work with potential candidate cities to provide better information to them and better insight to them on what's really involved in a mega event, and to help them to build stronger business cases for each city that align the games much more closely with the city's own strategies and its own objectives. And the aim here is very much to avoid bidding cities developing unrealistic plans, and then once awarded the games, having that sort of shock horror moment that we've seen far too often of understanding the reality and understanding that the costs are now ballooning away from what they thought they were going to be. And that pattern has been tremendously damaging for the whole industry, and is one of the key reasons so many potential candidate cities withdraw. The second 3 stages of the cycle there apply that once the games have been awarded, and the focus here is to shifts to focusing on the support and guidance needed by a new organising committee to help it plan and deliver the games and to realise those legacy benefits. I think the best way of describing the old model, which is still in use by most mega events at the moment, is that it's a bit like handing over the keys of a brand new Ferrari to an organising committee that hasn't yet learned to drive, and then saying to them, here's the transfer of knowledge manual, the top manual of how the last organising committee learned to drive. Read it, digest it, and then bring me back the Ferrari in 7 years' time with no dents or scratches. And when I get it back, I want it to be more powerful, more fuel efficient, and have more bells and whistles than when I gave it to you. And I'll stop by every 6 months and pop my head in and just see how you're getting on. So some organising committees, they read that TOK manual avidly and they copy it exactly on the basis of, well, if it worked for them, it'll work for us. However, it's not usually as straightforward as that, and each host city is different, and time moves on, and technology and business processes evolve. So that sort of copy-paste approach can end up making in outdated approaches and potentially repeating mistakes made by previous OCs. Some OCs throw the manual straight out the window, and they jump right in behind the wheel, and with the confidence of a 17-year-old, they'll try to figure this out as they go along, and they drive that Ferrari like they stole it, and that doesn't usually end well either. So the old model, carries considerable risk for the success of the event. Therefore, to support the OCs through all of those stages of the life cycle, the CGF have set up something called CGF Partnerships, and it's a not-for-profit joint venture vehicle between the CGF and Sport5, and Sport5 until recently were known as Lagardère Sport. The JV is chaired and controlled by the CGF, and Sport5 takes responsibility for the commercial programme, the sponsorship and TV deals, and all the commercial sales. Now, the objective of CGF Partnerships is to work with candidate cities on those phases of the games to help them to better formulate their responses, to be a better fit with their existing capability and strategy, and obviously to avoid unexpected surprises. And then once an OC is appointed, CGFP embeds games experienced individuals into key roles in the OC to accelerate the planning cycles and reduce the overall time needed, bringing best practice and hopefully avoiding the tendency to reinvent the wheel or indeed repeat past mistakes. So just going back to costs and affordability for a moment, there are other parameters that the CGF sets out to limit the scale and therefore the costs of an event. So the first parameter is obviously the number of sports that are in the programme. For the Commonwealth Games, there are 16 core sports, which include the parasport versions. And in addition, the host city has the opportunity to choose others from a optional list in order to tailor the event to better fit existing facilities that may be in that host city, and also to include sports that are of particular interest to the local audience. Birmingham chose to add women's 2020 cricket, beach volleyball, and 3-on-3 basketball, making a total of 19 sports, 8 of which include parasports. Now, the format of the sports, the numbers of fields of play, the number of sessions involved, all of those are things that drive costs for the organising committee and for its suppliers. In addition, the CGF also places a cap on the number of athletes that can compete. So the core programme is limited to between 3,800 and 4,000 athletes, and optional sports can only increase that by another 500. So it's evident that that's another factor that drives costs, because it clearly drives the size of the village, the amount of accommodation required for athletes, athlete transport systems, the amount of catering required, and all of those factors. And thinking about venues, clearly the fit of sport to available venues is a key cost driver. Some sports have very specific requirements. So, for example, aquatics is sort of kind of hard to stage that sport without a pool, whereas other sports are much easier to house in multi-purpose venues. But then existing venue hire, whether you've got a new build or temporary venues construction costs, those are all major elements of that drive the overall costs for the OSC as well. So putting a framework around it, sports, athletes, and venue choices certainly helps to manage the budget, but nonetheless, trying to do apples and apples comparisons between different games, or indeed editions of the same games, is always very difficult, because other factors also influence cost trends in absolute terms. So things like the security requirements, for all sports and all events are changing over the years quite significantly, and that directly impacts policing and security costs, and indirectly impacts operational areas such as transport, venue management, catering, logistics. And then service levels have undoubtedly increased over time as each edition strives to be better than the last. And that ratchets up the expectations across sports, across sport presentation, across opening and closing ceremonies, across Queen's Baton Relay, across legacy programs, and so forth. Now, the absolute costs of technology is also influenced in this by the same range of factors related to sports and venues and size of workforce, but also to changes in technology such as the growth of digital services and the increasing investment necessary to combat cybersecurity threats. So looking at absolute numbers for technology is not always that helpful, but perhaps a better way of looking at it is to look at the cost of technology as a proportion of the overall operating costs of an organising committee. And this particular table, I think, is one that Christian and I have talked about a bit in the past. And it tells a story about different events, different scale events, and the role technology plays. Not surprisingly, the Olympic Games is the highest percent of total budget. And in part, that's because the scale is just so large, and the service levels are definitely the highest. And we know the ISC technology team are working hard with the OCOGs to bring that percentage down. Back in 2015 was an interesting challenge, because in scale it was maybe just under half the size of Olympic Games, but the service levels were actually in many ways comparable. And it was in a country that were an underdeveloped technology sector. So it was a great opportunity, but in truth probably more of an imperative to try a new approach, as there was less than 2 years to organise those games in that case. But for me, what was really interesting was being able to go back to Azerbaijan in 2017 and organise another big event in the same city with many of the same venues and many of the same people, and to be able to reuse much of the technology systems and services that we'd installed originally for the European Games. And we were able to develop what was a fairly large event in under 12 months and for less than half of the equivalent technology budget. So admittedly, those circumstances are possibly unique, but the conclusion I drew from that is that the technology figure for an edition of, let's say, a tier 2 event like the European Games or the Commonwealth Games could well be somewhere between 5 to 12% of the operating budget of the organising committee. So that makes me think that the figure in the table there for Glasgow of 8 to 9% is probably not an unreasonable target for a technology team to aim for. So thinking about the technology strategy for the Commonwealth Games and how we deliver those games more efficiently, I naturally drew on some of my key learnings from the various previous events I've worked on. Now, I've already mentioned the keys to the Ferrari example, and the fact that the games to games transfer of knowledge is imperfect. And just to illustrate that a little bit more, a very short story from London 2012. Now, in London, I was the head of venue technology. And one of my job was to work with the functional areas who worked in the venues to gather the requirements for all of the equipment and technology in the venues. Now, from the transfer of knowledge process that we have in Beijing, and the seminars and the documents we got from them, our head of telecoms, Emma, was very clear that it was 10,000 radios was what Beijing had contracted, and 10,000 radios was therefore what she had based her budget on. Yet when I was having these conversations with the functional areas, I was really struggling because the numbers I was getting back was a requirement for 17,000 radios. And I would go back to her and tell her this, and she would beat me about the head and send me back out again to do better. So I'd go out and try and do better. And I'm trying very hard. I managed to get the number down to about 15,000, but I could not get it below that. So eventually, getting tired of getting beaten up by Emma, I gave John Carlo a ring of the IOC. Now, this was a couple of years after Beijing had finished. So John happily was still in contact with some of the Beijing team. And what he learned from them was that 10,000 radios was the number of radios that the organizing committee in Beijing had actually procured. But what he also learned from them was that had been included two large pieces of scope. So the catering, cleaning and waste company and the security companies. And when they were contracted, they brought their own radios. And funny enough, that was another 7,000 radios. So the actual number Beijing used was something around 17,000. And of course, that meant, we'd taken the transfer of knowledge stuff absolutely for gospel and hadn't really perhaps questioned it enough to understand that it wasn't really an apples for apples comparison in the way we thought it might be. And that, of course, was quite an expensive budget impact for us at the time. So I think the thing to learn from that is transfer of knowledge is great, but you do need to question it. The next point is that trying new things and making new mistakes is a much better thing to do than repeating mistakes from previous games. In fact, I don't think there's ever any excuse for repeating previous mistakes. The other thing I learned, I think, is that every event I've worked on has had something to offer in value in terms of valuable learning. And I know that when I was recruiting the London 2012 venue technology team, I didn't perhaps at that time place enough value on the benefits that come from having a wide and event experience. But in my defense, I think I'm a bit older and hopefully a bit wiser now. Time is not your friend. Clearly, that's very true if you have too little time. But in this context, I think the opposite, which is too long a time, is almost worse. Appointing host cities 7 years before the Games increases the operating costs of the organising committee without any doubt, because as soon as it's established, people are employed, they're paid salaries, they need an office to work from, they need technology. And so reducing the total operating period of an organising committee from 7 years to 4 years, or even to 3 years, is clearly going to help contain the overall costs of the event. The European Games in Baku was the first ever European Games, and that meant that we had no previous Games templates to follow. And with less than 2 years to go and a lack of that developed technology sector that I mentioned, that meant we had to take a risk to essentially become a wholly cloud-based organization. And that was the first for any mega event. But it was the only way that we could deliver the core IT platforms and the games management systems in time. But the real kicker for me was returning to Baku for the Islamic Solidarity Games in 2017, which I mentioned earlier. And just being able to spin that core technology system back up again was so easy and so cost effective that it made me really realize just how powerful that move to cloud-based platforms could be if it was harnessed across multiple editions of a games. I also just want to say, in Baku, I was really, really fortunate to have an excellent and really very, very experienced team who all understood at a deep level the DNA of a big event. And we all knew what the operating target model needed to look like. So that meant we could spend time focusing on understanding the local culture and how to get things done in that environment. It simply wouldn't have been possible to deliver an event of that scale and of that quality in the time we had without that group of people. I think the next thing is to recognize that the switch to cloud technology also hugely simplified the infrastructure needed at venues. We moved away from fairly complex configurations of traditional games and admin network arrangements to just simply needing an internet connection. And we carried that philosophy of simplification through into all of our planning. And all of that served to reduce the technology user footprint at venues. And that in turn meant less network infrastructure, and that meant less time needed on a venue to install, and obviously to remove it after the games. But I think perhaps my biggest learning from events relates to the success that can be achieved when you recruit core team members with the right mindset and the right experience, and create the right learning and coaching environment for them to unlock the potential of the host city talent. So both London 2012 and Baku 2015 ran amazingly effective intern and Games Academy programs. For Baku 2015, we had about 400 experienced international staff and about 1,500 Azerbaijani nationals. When we did Baku 2017, there were only 50 or so international staff because all the other roles were filled by the tremendously talented local Azeris who stepped up to take on those much more senior roles for those games. And I was really pleased to have the opportunity during the Gold Coast Games in the Commonwealth to meet up with 5 of those guys who had started it in Baku 2015 with no games experience and were now working for the Gold Coast Organising Committee, having themselves joined the International Games Gypsy ranks. So back to Birmingham. Back to Birmingham has 2 meanings for me, really. It's obviously about how do we sort of take the slides so far and condense that learning down into our approach for the Games in Birmingham. But the second meaning is more personal, as Birmingham's the city where actually I was born. And I grew up until I was 16, when my family moved to the west of Ireland. So it feels sort of right that I should be going back to Birmingham, much later in my life to help make the Commonwealth Games there, be a catalyst for Birmingham to regenerate, to put itself on the map again, to regain a sense of self-belief and civic pride, something that perhaps has been missing for the last few decades. So, looking at the lessons learned and boiling it down, they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and this particular picture is one that I've used a few times before, and probably a few people on this webinar might have seen as well. The jigsaw pieces represent all of the various elements that you need to put together to make up the technology and broadcast scope. And also, in most cases, they relate to the particular size of supplier or partner scopes that need to be procured. Sometimes the labels on the jigsaw pieces change a little, and some of the labels, like event management systems, actually hide behind them the fact that there are 10, 12, 15 different systems and applications necessary behind that piece of the jigsaw. The colours are the natural groupings, for me at least, of the contract. So the light blue represents anything to do with timing, scoring, and results, and light green here represents anything to do with sort of telecoms, and so on. And this tends to also reflect how I tend to structure the management teams I work with. As you can see from this, the scope is pretty broad, and it covers everything from the basic email systems and IT and telecoms through finance, procurement, and HR and other systems that most regular organizations need from the moment they start up to the moment they close down. But it also covers all of the event-specific applications and technologies needed by the function areas to plan and deliver their games time services. And it also covers direct deliverables from technology in terms of games time infrastructure and services like the host broadcasting and time and scoring and results. I'll reference back to some of these jigsaw pieces in a moment. This particular slide really sort of encapsulates the technology strategy now for the Commonwealth Games, and it's the template we're using for Birmingham, and one that we'll hopefully build on and refine and use for the next 3 games out to 2030. And this really tries to encapsulate all the learnings I've mentioned so far and the aims from a technology perspective, and ultimately helps to a new OC to learn how to drive that Ferrari like the careful learner we want them to be. So it's worth saying, first of all, that the overall aim here is to reduce the life of an OC from 7 years down to 4 years or less. And to support that, we need to make sure that once the OC is formally established, we can start up super quickly, with ready-to-go IT systems, ready-to-go finance and HR, ready-to-go project management tools, document management systems, and good processes and support in place. And that clearly is going to avoid the time and cost of implementing interim IT and potentially avoid sometimes poor decisions that might be made around corporate applications that later need to be unpicked. Now, the learnings for me from the Baku 2015 to Baku 2017 transition tells me that this is entirely achievable with cloud-based solutions. It's entirely possible to scale up one games and then rapidly scale up again for the next, or even to run 2 or more organised committees in parallel. So we're taking that philosophy and we are architecting the core IT systems for Birmingham to actually make that happen. On strategic partnerships, I'm referring now back to the jigsaw picture and thinking about some of the event-specific services. It's not unusual for a new organising committee to spend months scoping out the detailed requirements of, let's say, timing and scoring and systems, and then to start a procurement process to select a supplier or partner. And this will involve clearly subject matter expertise from a timing and scoring results person, possibly also from a sports competition perspective. It will certainly involve a procurement manager. It will involve a financial planner, probably a commercial sponsorship person, and very definitely lawyers, lots of lawyers and lots of documents. And depending on where the games are held, those procurement processes could easily take 6 months to a year to achieve. And that's a lot of expensive people for a lot of time. And at the end of that process, you still end up sitting across the table from the same 2 or 3 companies that you dealt with before on all the other events you've worked on. And that's because there generally are only 2 or 3 companies that can deliver these services at the right scale. And those companies themselves have also spent months of time with their subject matter experts and their financial modelers and their procurement bid leads and their commercial sponsorship person. And don't forget their lawyers, especially not their lawyers. And that's just responding to the invitation to tender. Right? And it doesn't seem like a good idea to have to repeat that over and over again each time you do an event. So instead, this time around in Birmingham, what we're going to do is we're going to run a competitive process. And when it makes economic sense to do so, and where suppliers are willing, we will look for opportunity to extend those contracts for the next 3 games through a strategic partnership program. And we'll use that to build long-term relationships with those suppliers. Now, the areas where we've done that already are with Longines for timing and scoring. We've also appointed an IT resources partner, so that the team that will create that core IT platform that we can scale up and scale down again. We haven't announced who they are yet, so I can't give you the name, but that will be very, very soon, the next couple of weeks. We've also appointed Sunset and Vine as our host broadcaster for 2022, and we can extend that contract for 2026 and 2030. And we're applying this philosophy to our event management system suppliers as well, which is a procurement that we're just about to start. We're likely to do the same with digital services, probably also with our radio communications platform, possibly also with venue audiovisual, and indeed our network hardware categories. Now, when you take all of that out, and the remaining pieces of the jigsaw that you're left with are those things that are probably best procured in each host country. And to support the OC in each of those events, CGFP will provide access to selected subject matter experts to work with the local OC to scope out the required services and to understand the local supplier market, and then to work with the OC to procure the best value solutions. So fixed and mobile telecoms is often one of the largest and most complex contracts placed by the technology teams, and this is usually a good example of a service that really does have to be provided by the local market partner. Technology toolkit refers to that collection of stuff that OCs and function areas just need to plan and run their operations. Often it's short notice stuff that needs some sort of business workflow around it. It's a bit more than a spreadsheet, but it's not a full application. And it often fills a gap that can't be economically provided by a third-party provider. So it ends up usually getting developed in-house by someone who's got a good SharePoint or Java or .NET background. And then once the games is finished, it gets thrown away, and next time over, someone else picks up the mantle and starts all over again and reinvents them. So our tactic here basically is just to develop those utility tools once, and then we plan to refine them and reuse them games to game. So we're building them very much with longevity in mind. This includes simple forms and workflows such as the SLAM process, which is the starters, leavers, and movers process. So this basically enables anyone who's brand new to the organising committee, and let's face it, there are going to be over 1,000 of those. It assigns them to their functional area. It organises them to a laptop. It provides an email account. It gets them a building pass, a desk to sit at, and all access to all the various applications they need. The toolkit also includes things like integrated project management tools. So we have a combined risks and issues registers. It includes a central document management system for storage of all FA documents, team collaboration sites, extranets for working securely with external partners, and many other things as well. So a real hodgepodge of things that are difficult to normally get from the external market. The final strand here is strategic secondees. And this is where CGFP second games experts into specific OC roles. And there are several thoughts for the rationale behind this. The first thought behind this, the first part of this rationale, relates to the anecdote I talked about London radios and Beijing radios. And that tells us that while traditional transfer knowledge is valuable and helpful, it still can't convey all of the understanding and all the context and all the colour that the decisions and choices that lie behind the decisions and choices made by each OC. And the best vehicle for that really is the brain of somebody who was actually there. The second reason for the second E strand is because we're going to put this long-term strategic partner program in place. It's important that we maintain continuity, and therefore continuity on both sides of that fence, not just with the partner but with the person they're interfacing with, is important to keep their partners honest. But also that continuity allows us to put the basis for a long-term roadmap and development of our products as well. The third reason is for the choice of secondary roles is really about which roles games experience is really particularly valuable in, partly to sort of influence the strategy of the organising committee, or are key to continuity of partners, as I've just mentioned, or are key to managing particular budget pinch points that could otherwise, without those roles, necessarily run away from a citadel. And for Birmingham 2022, those are the CIO role, the head of any technology, the head of time scoring and results, and the head of game systems. And the final reason for the strategic condies is it really goes back to having seen the values of having a body of games experience experts embedded as a core part of the OC team, who in turn can work with and coach and develop locally hired non-games experienced staff and support their journeys. So essentially they can learn how to drive the CGS Ferrari in the careful manner we would really like them to. So I've talked a lot about Ferraris, so this is just a gratuitous picture of a Ferrari. Sadly, I don't expect our transport team will be able to get any of these into our transport fleet, but maybe one day there'll be a chance. I've also talked a lot about Birmingham 2020, so it is only appropriate that I tell you a little bit more about it. Some of the points on this particular slide I've already mentioned and talked through, in particular the projected boost to the regional economy based on the Commonwealth Games value framework and the 3-to-1 ratio of pounds return for every pound invested. It's also worth, I think, stressing that for us, providing social value to the region is incredibly important to us. And that manifests itself in many ways, but in technology, much of it comes down to finding ways of providing local employment to local people, helping to train and upskill people to leave a better legacy skills better after the games, and to choose to place contracts where we can with local businesses. And for Birmingham, we estimate that across the entire OC, about £300 million worth of values of contract will be placed with local businesses. Now, a great example of this, I think, is with our host broadcaster, Sunset and Vine. So they plan to recruit 200 local people into a year-long broadcast training scheme. The recruits will reflect the diversity of the region, and 25% of those people will come from underrepresented and disadvantaged groups. There'll be about 150 paid games time roles that those people will eventually go into as a core part of the host broadcast team. Now, in addition, the host broadcaster has a total workforce of about 1,600 people, and they're committing to 25% of that workforce coming from the West Midlands region. So that's above and beyond the trainees. And Sunset and Vine are going to appoint local suppliers where they can, in particular local supplier for the host broadcaster workforce catering, and a local supplier to design and produce sustainable host broadcast uniforms. So that's a really good example of where one of our partners is working with us to also deliver some of our social value commitments to the region. This next slide just gives you an indication of where we're up to currently in our planning cycle. The thing to note, I think, here is, there was no one in the organising committee until June 2018. So no employees until 2 months after the Gold Coast Games. And the whole life cycle, therefore, is just over 4 years. Right now, we're about 130 people, which is below where Glasgow and Gold Coast were at the same point in time. However, the planning levels we've achieved have already exceeded both of those games, and we've appointed more of our key suppliers, and we've secured more of our sponsorship revenues at this stage. Now, overall, we plan to deliver the games with a workforce of about 1,100 people, which is 700 less than Gold Coast and about 400 less than Glasgow. So a big challenge, but one we think we can achieve. Now, 2 weeks today, it'll be 2 years to go to the Birmingham opening ceremony. And I think when we started working on these games, we knew we were working with a very challenging timescale. We knew we were implementing a new delivery model. We knew we were working with an organising committee that was set up as part of a public body rather than a private entity. And that, of course, introduces another level of process challenge. And we knew we were dealing with the challenge of EU exit with all the unknown risks that involved. What we didn't know, what we couldn't have predicted, was that we were dealing with a 2020 that has been without doubt in every way conceivable an absolutely extraordinary year. This year has forced us all out of our comfort zones. It's pushed us to find resources and strengths within us that we didn't know we had. But being eventers, and therefore generally being of a positive mindset, we tend to want to think of the journey as being 2020 now as the year of challenges, 2021 as the year of recovery, and 2022 as the year of celebration. And for us in the UK in 2022, it marks the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. It also marks 100 years of the BBC, which is one of the great bastions of UK cultural identity. And it also marks a year-long Festival UK, celebrating the best in UK arts and culture. And Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games, will be right at the heart of that celebration, celebrating diversity, human endeavour, human achievement, connectedness, and togetherness. And that's what, for me, this is all about. Now I'd like to just click into a short video to tell you in pictures and music, I guess, what that means to Birmingham.
Adrian, what a great presentation, and a great video to end on to inspire us all. It really brings it home as to why we do what we do.
Absolutely. I think OFC videos are always fantastically inspiring.
but yeah, really great information today. Thank you so much for sharing it, and some great insights. I think for me, the pie, it's a bit like reinventing, I think, the mega event. And I think the work that you've demonstrated here that CGFP are doing is really helping to recraft and reshape the mega event. And it's really important to our industry to have this approach. We talk a lot about it. We're all involved in how we can improve the delivery model. So it's fantastic to see the work that CGFP has been able to do, and obviously your contribution, a big part of that, but taking the learnings forward. So yeah, great to see. I've got a question for you. I've got a couple of questions here that have come up on the chat, so we'll go straight into those. Okay. So First question here from Ashley. Thanks for the question, Ashley. What long-term benefits are in the pipeline for the surrounding communities? The Gold Coast Games left behind a new transport line for Gold Coast residents. Will Birmingham see similar developments?
I travelled on that transport line at Gold Coast, and indeed it was fantastic. Probably spent more time on that than any other form of transport. So yes, I mean, I guess you think of benefits from the games. There are clearly the harder benefits like transport improvements, infrastructure improvements, and there are the softer benefits in terms of skills and legacies and things. In the case of Birmingham, I think what we're seeing is that Birmingham City Council is essentially using the games there as a catalyst to bring forward investment and accelerate some of the developments that might have been in the pipeline a bit further down the track. So no pun intended, but part of that actually is the extension of the metro system that runs through the centre of the city. So it runs from Wolverhampton into the centre of the city and is now been extended out towards Edgbaston as well. So that's one thing that sort of that has been rushed forward, if you like. Then obviously there's the sort of refurbishment of public spaces within the city. Then clearly obviously the development of the venues themselves. So the addition of a new aquatic centre. The refurbishment of Alexander Stadium. So yes, there are definite sort of infrastructure improvements and also physical legacy improvements, and then the softer benefits of skills and legacy.
Yeah, you talk about the Gold Coast tramline and the infrastructure. I grew up on the southern Gold Coast, and seeing that, going back there for home games to see that infrastructure in place was fantastic. And it's something that was needed. I mean, there was a trams lines there back many years ago. It was great to see them back in place. It really helped. So next question here from John. With the strategic partnerships approach, what complications does this provide for 2026 and 2030 in meeting government expectations of local national staffing while also balancing people knowledge? And the second part there, will organising committees be forced to buy out the partnerships contract if government authorities insist local? Good question. Thanks, John.
No, it's a really good question, one we're really conscious of. Obviously, the reason we're doing this is because we want to make the games more sustainable in the long run and economically sustainable. And by running a robust procurement process for Birmingham and mostly public procurement processes, what we're doing is we're inviting obviously interest from all interested parties. Now, if we take the example of the host broadcaster, which I mentioned in the slides. When we come to whatever the next host city is going to be, one of the assessments that will need to be made is how will we work with the host broadcaster to demonstrate that they are the right company to provide the services at the right value in the context of the next host city. So for them it means, does this host city have a developed freelance broadcast market? Does it have broadcast equipment suppliers? Because essentially what the host broadcast team is a very small core team that then basically contracts everything to suppliers, and there's no reason why those wouldn't be local suppliers in the local market. In fact, every reason why they would be, because clearly it must be cheaper to do that than it is to truck or ship or fly this stuff around the world. And that's pretty much the same with much of our other contracts. So the IT resourcing partner one I mentioned earlier, what we actually see persisting between the games is a small core managing that core platform. The actual volume of people involved in delivering the services, the people who manage the service desks, the people who are going to be out on venues, all come from the local community. So that is very much a model about how do you take that knowledge with that supplier and the people who've been seconded and also moved to the next games, and work with the local organising committee to offer those jobs and employ people and train them in the local host city as well. So those aren't complications. Those are just sort of part of the model of how do we continue to demonstrate social value to every host city that we go to. Because it's not good enough to just say, we have a supplier, here you go, take it or leave it. We have to continually show why this is best value for money.
So, and on that, do you have them? Obviously, it sounds like you've got the mechanisms in place to be able to support that collaboration. I mean, because that's one of the challenges with the old model, if you like. It's unfortunately, here's our suppliers, these are the best ones, go and use them. That's what it costs. How does that mechanism work? Is that something you've developed with regard to the procurement processes?
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously there's the whole contractual structure around this, because normally an organising committee would contract with a supplier for a given games, but in this instance we're contracting with as an OC with a supplier, but also CGFB is contracting with that supplier in an overarching framework, and that framework, determines the criteria, if you like, that will apply for us to successfully extend that contract to the next games.
Yeah.
Part of those criteria are about, have you met the key performance indicators for Birmingham? Did you deliver what you said you would deliver to the standard expected? And part of it is about, are you still being benchmarked and able to demonstrate value in the next host city? So that's another part of it, part of the sort of overall contractual structure that enables us to get there. And it's taken us a little while to work that through, because when we first sat down and started talking to suppliers about how would this work, it got really complicated, because you're trying to deal with different currencies and different inflation rates, and how do you index that? And in the end, we said, the easiest way to do this is to, from a contractual structure, from a value for money structure, as long as you can track things back. If there are changes, and there will be changes, because there'll be more or less sports, there'll be more or less venues, so there will be changes. Track that back to your answer for Birmingham when you went through a public procurement process. And if those changes have a strong rationale behind it, that still demonstrates that that this is a open, transparent, and good value for money process.
Yeah.
So obviously the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. This is a template that, a bit like an airplane, building it while you fly it. We're doing it very much the same approach here.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like and I guess this is one of the benefits of having some robust government procurement policies and strategies to really support that, because as we all know, procurement is royalty when we're delivering these events, and we talked about that before. And having that framework or those lessons would be really helpful going forward. That's great. Okay. So next question here from Antonio. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I have two questions. What are some examples of leveraging strategies to ensure a positive environmental impact of the Commonwealth Games in 2022? And the second part is, would you consider a virtual media centre to be a feasible strategy, similar to the Inspiration Games in Zurich delivered last week? Thank you. Thanks, Antonio.
Okay. The strategies for positive environmental impact, in the slides when I talked about social value, I said for technology, this usually means jobs for local people. It usually means basic contracts with local businesses. But actually, there are 5 strands to the Birmingham 2022 Social Value Charter, which is published on the website, which you can go and have a look at. And one of those is very much about environmental impact. So we also, as part of our procurement processes, we award 10% of the marks to the social value question. And social value question includes environmental impact as well. So we ask suppliers, please tell us how you will demonstrate concern for the environment, and sometimes that's about the choice of products that are used as part of their delivery. Sometimes it's about how they dispose of those products. Sometimes it's about offsetting carbon. Sometimes it's about reducing the number of flights or travel journeys necessary. And in the case of the house broadcast, I use the example of they want to work with a local business to actually design a sustainable and recyclable uniform for those broadcast teams. So that is something that is absolutely core to all of our procurements, and something we have a very big focus on. Now, in terms of the virtual media centre, I'm not familiar with the Inspiration Games. I'm sorry, so I don't know what happened last week in Zurich, and I can imagine that given the current circumstances with COVID-19, pretty much everything is virtual. But we certainly, and in the case of London, we're not actually having a main press centre, so there is no media centre such as a drop-in hub, but there is no sort of one central place for journalists to come. But we did consider what we called a virtual IBC, because the IBC is one of those things. International Broadcast Centre is one of those things that's a huge venue. It's usually very, very expensive. It takes a long time to sort of build it out, and it's it's a main non-competition venue. But we're almost at the point where technology is dictating, do we really need one anymore? And when I was working as part of the Los Angeles bid team for 2024, it was certainly something we looked at very seriously in the context of being able to piggyback on NBC's facilities in Los Angeles. Now, for when we came to look at the host broadcasting contract for the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, we asked the respondents to actually come back to us with a cost for a traditional IBC model and a cost for a virtual IBC model. And our virtual IBC model essentially means you still need a facility somewhere that's going to do, the production and the routing and the switching and all the rest of it. But what you don't necessarily need is a space that host broadcasters, will build studios out in, because there's been a trend away from that for a number of years. And I think, we've seen, Gold Coast as a recent example where, a very big IBC being built out in the conference centre there was not actually that well used, in terms of host broadcasters visiting it. So we're on that cusp, certainly. Now, what came back from us was, in some cases, there was maybe a slight financial advantage to doing a virtual IBC, but you have to offset that against the fact that you've got additional telecoms costs now, because you're now delivering the feeds from the venues to a different location. And to be honest, there wasn't a lot in it at that point in time. And given that, in the case of Birmingham, we had already committed to the venue hire fees for the NEC, we didn't have the benefit of being able to take that into consideration in the sums as well. So for us, we eventually decided to stick with a traditional NEC at the IBC, traditional IBC at the NEC, but we expect it to be much smaller in scale than previous games.
That's great. I think there's also, we're probably in that space of having a little bit of a hybrid model, with a lot of technical service company now providing remote production facilities for sport.
Absolutely.
Certainly seen that here in Switzerland, and certainly across Europe. And it's a space that we're looking at, certainly going ahead for Paris 2024, is to say, well, okay, I mean, may not be for the IBC, we'll still need that space, but looking at how do we repurpose these facilities? Could they be used for sport presentation? Could they be used for some other function within the rights holders? So it's pulling apart a little bit. Maybe we're evolving to a little bit of a hybrid model going forward in the coming years as they evolve.
And question, that's absolutely right, because one of the things we are getting our host broadcaster to do is, traditionally not all of the fields of play of all sports are covered by broadcast.
Yeah.
So for badminton, for example, only 2 of the 5 courts are covered. For squash, 1 or 2 of the 6 courts are covered. Table tennis, 2 of the 10 tables. Bowls, only 2 of the 24 rings.
Yeah.
So the challenge we pose to those broadcasters is, how do you get coverage from all of the fields of play? And how do you do that using new digital production techniques? Yes. And that absolutely uses remote production. So that's exactly the sort of stuff that will end up being in the IBC. It's remotely controlled cameras, remote production of, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, courts at squash, 10 of the 24 bowls, rigs, and so on and so forth. So for the first time, we can guarantee that for every single athlete competing in the Commonwealth Games, we will actually get them somewhere on TV at some point.
And it's also down to the ability to consume, because obviously the viewers are looking for that content. And what we're seeing is in some of the other federations are doing this with their localized and national sport, is being able to broadcast to some level, whether it be live streaming or otherwise, to their whole market. So I think this is, again, I think we'll see an evolution of hybrid model. So we'll see how it happens. Sorry, I realized in looking at the time that I just thought they're great questions, so thanks for popping them in. The question here from Robin, hello from India. Hi, great to have you with us. How are you planning to use technology to engage with fans from participating nations?
Good question. Fan engagement is one of the hot topics at the moment. One of the you'll all recognise this, but one of the great challenges here is that organising committees put an awful lot of effort into developing their fan engagement and build an audience that grows and grows and grows and absolutely goes to the sky at games time, as people sort of come to the website to see what the results of the events are. And then after the games, it all goes away and that audience just completely dissipates. And there's very little, in fact, mostly nothing, until the next organising committee starts up for those audiences is to persist between games. So in the case of the Commonwealth Sport, what we're going to do is actually it's going to be a Commonwealth Sport initiative rather than just an organising committee initiative, to actually start to put in place a framework under which sits each of the future organising committees. So once Birmingham 2022 is done, we'll essentially transition the audience to Commonwealth Sport. And part of that is about understanding, what media assets do we have, understanding of the audiences, who are the people who follow Commonwealth sports, what are they really interested in, what are their ages, what are they, how can we speak to them in a more effective way? So that's a big focus for us right at the moment. And when I mentioned on the slides, going out to do our digital procurements, it's very much about, what is the sort of the content factory that isn't just being built for Birmingham, but will persist between the games, and that will get used again by the next OC and the OC after that as well.
Yeah, on that fit, that feeds into the last question and our last comments about, being able to produce every field of play gives us that range of content and that access to the viewing audience. That the audience then can, and we talk about production and fans and all the engagement, but it's also about for the athletes. We always bring this back, and I think it's such an important piece that the friends and family need to find a way. And not everybody can travel to go and watch their family member compete, and their athletes, and that core team supporting them, being able to watch them on live on television, whatever format that comes in, really is a really nice support.
We've got to be careful of the TV rights deals and all the rest of it here, but certainly, in terms of making content available to the CGAs, the Commonwealth Games associations, to the sport, to the athletes and their families, we have to find a way of being able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'm sorry, we've got time for one more question. Here from Derek. Hey Derek, how are you? Thank you for your insights, much appreciated. I applaud the Commonwealth Games Federation for its forward thinking in having suppliers partner with you to deliver the games for a 3-game cycle. Interested in your thoughts on potential pushback from future OCOGs for this philosophy. Kind of follows on from some of the comments earlier, but it is a tough one.
I mean, I think it sort of builds on what I said earlier, which is, we have to make these work for future organising committees. We definitely don't want to be in a model of foisting uncompetitive, expensive suppliers onto future organising committees where it just isn't good value for money. But there is real value here in working with the right partners, opening up some of the markets that potentially perhaps have been a little bit skewed, bringing some sort of fresh blood into this, but nonetheless still each time having to demonstrate that this is still really good value for money for the organising committee, and certainly been able to demonstrate that this is better value for money than if you were to start the process again and spend all that time with those lawyers and all those people in a year-long process of getting to what essentially is going to be one of the same 3 companies that we'd get to anyway.
Yeah, no, you've hit on the head. It's demonstrating the value, and I think that's where the collaboration starts. And sounds like that's the work that you've been doing to build that framework. So let's, as you say, let's see how it tastes and how it all works out. We look forward to having this follow-up in late 2022. I had some follow-up, just some comments, and I was just saying, for a lot of the audience are people who work in sport workers, but really excited to hear the work you're doing with the broadcasters, Sunset and Vine, engaging the 200 local people and looking to recruit the 25%. I think it is an important part of the program. It's an important part of the legacy, and it's great to hear that that work is happening, especially also listening to your hindsight, your learning experience in Baku, where you went from 500 internationals down to 50. Again, I think it really demonstrates that there's some great learning opportunities, but great opportunities for local people to participate in these events, but also then to take away a new skill set to support future events. So I think it's, again, a really good takeaway. So conscious that we've kind of run a little bit over time, so I want to say thank you, everybody online for bearing with us and joining us today. And a big thank you to Adrian. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, Adrian. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights and your experience, and wonderful to hear the work you've been doing with CGFP. So
thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Great. So everybody, we'll do our best to, there's a couple of questions there that we'll follow up. All of these will go out onto sportworker.com, where we'll post these into a forum, so you have the ability to tap into the questions and answers, and also to follow up if you've got further questions. Again, thank you for joining us for today, and stay safe. Wherever you are in the world, have a great day. Bye for now.